Hi, it's Nicole with Polycultured, and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you the evolution of our very first urban farm space in Brooklyn, New York. This is where our journey began, and because New York City is such an inaccessible place to garden, it was where we learned the most. This made our first experience full of challenges, but this informed us of the best and safest practices for gardening in urban spaces. In the fall of 2015, we acquired the space. The backyard of the brownstone was a basic dirt pile with a patio. The first two steps happened simultaneously. We started an indoor vermicompost by purchasing red wiggler worms and using a Rubbermaid bin. We stopped throwing away our food waste and began feeding it to the worms. Then we got our first set of baby chicks off of Craigslist. We decided that 4 was a good start and began raising them indoors in the fall. By winter, they were large enough to go outside, and I fashioned our very first chicken coop, the Chigloo, as it was still snowing outside. This was a poorly designed structure, and the heat lamp wasn't necessary, but we were learning as we went along. Eventually, the chicken manure and the vermicompost became integrated, and we sifted our very first finished compost sometime during the late winter, using egg cartons as seed trays for our first sowing. You can see we're big proponents of using what is free, available, or otherwise considered trash as long as it is safe from toxins. I began to research soil testing and learned it was extremely valuable information because of the potential risks of not just growing in contaminated soil, but touching that soil, breathing it in. All of that could also be dangerous. Brooklyn College does lead testing as well as a full heavy metals panel and nutrient panel. Sure enough, the native Brooklyn soil tested astronomically high at 986 parts per million for lead, when the recommended safe level is 63 parts per million or less for gardening. The safest level is of course 0, and we knew that soil remediation would be the next step, as this yard was hazardous to our health. Our shoes tracking the soil inside could have even been dangerous. So we had to decide on a remediation plan so that we could garden safely. This brings us to spring 2015. Our remediation plan was primarily to use a barrier method and then cultivate the soil ourselves. Not only does lead live in the soil, it lives in the groundwater as well. Winter snow and spring rain refill the groundwater table to prepare the natural world for the rapid growth that comes with warmer temperatures. The downside to this is that when the water table swells, it brings with it only contaminants that may be present. We did not want to take risks with our plant roots coming into contact with it. We decided to use a food-safe plastic tarp to cover the entire exposed area. This kept the soil and the groundwater completely separated. Then we used a flattened cardboard to create the base layer, followed by hay and topped with a generous amount of wood chips. We found a free wood chip pile at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, whose groundskeepers chip tons of tree matter and allow the public to haul it away as much as they'd like. It's raw and smells great. Sometimes the wood chip pile is heated if the heap is big enough. Little did we know that wood chips would become the basis and the key for much of our later gardening success. Wood chips were a great bottom layer for this particular remediation technique because they allow for successful bottom drainage when the tarp could have possibly trapped too much moisture with the soil. They drain, but they also soak in water as well to prevent pooling and flooding. Worms adore the wood chips, and we basically bred worms in that backyard by introducing the red wigglers to the wood chips. The population exploded after the first year. That brings us to the top layer, and a small anecdote. The chicken flock was just getting established, and we had produced maybe less than a gallon of soil ourselves, but spring was upon us and we wanted to get started planting. So we went to an organic gardening store and purchased about $100 worth of bagged Long Island compost, rumored to be of good quality. As you can see in the photos, we had placed our very first set of seeds and seedlings in this final and top layer of the remediation project. Almost all of these plants struggled, stunted, and later died. Later on, we would realize that compost isn't just made up of good vitamins and minerals, it is a biological civilization that is the most important element. The microbes, bacteria, fungi, nematodes, protozoa, microarthropods, and worms are the key players in making successful compost. Bagged compost, sitting in plastic, drying out in a bag, probably had little to no biological activity, and thus our first attempt at planting in it failed. It was only when we began to actively compost with food waste, the chicken manure, and a mixture of dry materials that we saw a successful harvest. It would be my recommendation not to waste your time or money on these products, which are lacking the biological life necessary to feed the plants what they need. Once we had made the yard a safe place for ourselves and the animals to be in, we began working on our next project, building a proper chicken coop. Again, what was most important to us was having a safe and cheap chicken coop that was accessible and easy to clean. Raw pallet wood was freely available and able to be transported, so we decided to learn how to construct a coop out of what is essentially like Lego blocks. With minimal hardware and tools, we constructed a chicken coop and a chicken run by fastening them together and using hardware cloth or chicken wire to seal up the slats. A staple gun or nails worked well to hold the wire to the frame. We used more wood chips for their bedding, and they quickly adjusted to their new spacious home. This allowed for them to come in and out of their sleeping quarters at their own pace, and required less daily maintenance from us, which is another cornerstone element to urban farming. Overall, the first season of planting was about learning what kind of environment the plants like to live in. We didn't have all that much success or an impressive harvest. We had been overambitious with the amount of seeds we bought and planted, only for them to struggle in an unsupportive soil environment. This was one of the more discouraging things about the first year. However, it really taught me the importance of the soil, the most overlooked component to a healthy garden. I simply didn't know, coming from the conventional messages that we're told about tilling your garden. I had no idea the importance of a compost-fed, no-dig, undisturbed soil system. Fall brought a different set of farming tasks. We knew we wanted to breed our chickens to produce more, but out of the 4 that we had started with, only 2 survived to adulthood. One was killed by a hawk, and the other probably died of coccidiosis, but we weren't very experienced at the time. So the 2 that we had left were both roosters. We decided to get some hens to begin the breeding process and had our first chicken hatch by incubator, which was quite the experience. Another thing we knew we wanted to do was save seeds. Because we wanted to try different varieties, but seeds become expensive quickly, our solution was to put out a call to fellow gardeners and see what was possible in terms of a seed network. Ask and you shall receive, because we quickly received donations and now have a seed library of over 120 kinds of heirloom or open pollinated seed varieties, some from all over the world. And also, this practice builds community and is a cultural tradition going back thousands of years. When it started to get cold, we began to explore techniques which could extend our growing season. Part of this was experimenting with vertical gardening techniques and using grow lights. There are some examples of using pallet wood lined with burlap and landscape fabric to grow herbs on our kitchen wall. These do take some maintenance, as the soil holding material does biodegrade with the presence of mycelium, so you'll have to replace it over time. Another technique we decided to use was the cold frame. This is basically taking a window frame and attaching it to an angled box to create a small microclimate. We grew cold season greens such as chard, kale, kohlrabi, which stayed alive during the winter in the cold frame. They're the type of plants that will freeze, and when the temps get above freezing, they'll thaw out again and produce sweet-tasting, delicious greens. We managed to keep many plants alive during the winter with this cold frame, as well as starting outdoor seeds about a month before the last frost of the season in late winter, so it started our season earlier. When our roosters came of age, they began crowing, which is not legal under city limits. Once they had fertilized the hens, who maintain their fertility by holding sperm in a pouch in their bodies for several weeks, it was time to attempt our first butchering. This process was humbling, and in the years since, I've learned a great reverence for our birds and for the cycle of their lives. This brings us to the winter of 2016. We were vastly more prepared the second winter. We had created a greenhouse with PVC pipe, and we purchased a greenhouse tarp. This allowed us to grow all winter, and we started direct sowing our seeds earlier. We had a much more successful harvest that year, partially because the compost was more mature and partially because the greenhouse gave us more time for planning and planting. We decided to move the compost pile into the greenhouse itself as a way to use biothermal energy to make it warmer. Every time we turned the compost pile, warm steam emanated from it, and thus added to the mean overall temperature inside the greenhouse. We also started our indoor seeds and egg cartons again in February. I really love this technique and I encourage you to try it. The reason why is because the cartons are made from biodegradable cardboard. When they are dampened through the growing process, they become soft and easy to pull apart. You can just bury the entire pod rather than disturb the fragile root system of the seedling. This burying technique has worked extremely well throughout the years, establishing strong, healthy roots in the plants. Overall, our spring and summer season the following year exceeded our expectations. We saw bigger results in our harvest, had our second incubation and chick hatching, and increased our flock size, which made the soil production abundant. We were able to constantly add new biological materials to the garden, and this made a huge difference in what we were able to accomplish in a small space. We saw a larger result in harvest, we had a second incubation and chick hatch, and we increased our flock size by breeding the chickens. Once our garden was established, we were extremely excited to start working with the local community. I had been collaborating with the community organizer who worked with local youth in an athletics and chess league. We thought the integration of a community farming program for kids would be another angle to make an example of a healthy living, even if you live in the city. In our first session, the kids helped us turn compost and learned about urban farming and got to check out the garden. We also did a seed saving demo with sunflowers to show the importance of sharing seeds. We had high hopes for this garden, and as you've heard over the past few minutes, we put our heart and soul into constructing it, tending to it, and nourishing it for our community. Unfortunately, the owners of the property may have seen our knowledge of the leaden backyard as a liability, and thus they declined to renew the lease with us. This left us very hurt because soil cultivation and garden cultivation in general take a lot of time and effort. We then had the task of dismantling the garden, but we did leave a number of inches of wood chips and soil that the next tenants would at least not have to be in contact with the lead soil. At this time, we decided leaving New York City would be the best option for us to continue our farm work. We left eggs on the stoop as the last symbol of our solidarity with the community. This concludes the overview of our Brooklyn garden. I hope you were able to learn something from this. These techniques took a lot of time, but hopefully with some background knowledge, you can implement our work in your own space in a more efficient and educated manner. Thanks for listening to this informational video by Polycultured. If you'd like to support our work, please go to www.patreon.com/polycultured. Thanks again.